They dragged him into the square, stripped, trembling, helpless. Without warning, molten gold was poured into his throat. His screams burned through the night as skin blistered and bones shook. The crowd gasped, frozen in horror. This was not punishment, it was a message. Cruelty carved in flesh. A life melted before their eyes. Who could do this, and why? Tonight, we reveal the most horrifying death history tried to forget. The city stretched like a shadow under a sky, choked with smoke, its streets slick with the remnants of rain that had fallen hours ago, mixing with the blood, ash, and despair that lingered like a permanent stain. Towering buildings of stone and iron loomed over narrow alleys, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to whisper secrets of betrayal and cruelty. Every step echoed with a hollow resonance, as though the stones themselves mourned the lives that had been broken within these walls. In the heart of this oppressive labyrinth moved a man of quiet ambition, his eyes scanning the crowd with a mixture of fear and defiance, a pulse quickened not by excitement, but by the anticipation of inevitable doom. He was a man whose lineage promised power, yet whose skin and heritage marked him as other, as lesser in the eyes of those who ruled with iron fists and whispered poison. Every glance, every hushed conversation carried subtle threats, small injustices, stacked like bricks against him, building a wall of tension so thick that even the air seemed to resist his passage. The market square was alive with murmurs, merchants counting coins while children fled from quarrels, unaware that the true violence was not in the petty thefts or scuffles, but in the calculated, systemic cruelty that awaited him. Shadows shifted, unnaturally as the sun dipped lower, painting the world in blood-hued light, and the man felt the weight of countless eyes upon him, not in curiosity, but in judgment, in a silent declaration that his fate was already written. There was no comfort in the city's stone halls, only whispers of betrayal, the occasional distant scream, the metallic tang of fear mixed with smoke and dust. He moved through narrow corridors where the air was thick and walls seemed to lean in with judgment, a claustrophobic prelude to a nightmare that had been meticulously orchestrated for months. Even the wind carried a note of warning, rattling shutters and lifting scraps of torn paper, messages from unseen enemies who delighted in watching him navigate a world designed to crush him. Every sense was heightened, the faint smell of rot from the alleyways, the glint of blade in the darkened corners, the stifling closeness of the crowd's gaze, all conspiring to remind him that his life had become a fragile candle in a storm of hatred. And yet he pressed forward, each step a delicate negotiation between survival and the knowledge that something far worse than mere death awaited him. The city was alive, not with vitality, but with anticipation, a breathless pause before the storm of cruelty was unleashed, and the man knew that history's eyes were upon him, ready to witness the grotesque unfolding of injustice like never before. In the outskirts, beyond the trembling lamplight of the square, the man's past lingered, like a shadow he could not outrun. His childhood had been a tapestry of whispered slights and open hostility, a relentless curriculum in survival against a world that measured worth not by courage or intellect, but by the arbitrary lines of blood and skin. The forests that skirted the city had once offered solace, their dense canopies concealing him from hunters, both literal and metaphorical, who sought to claim what they believed was theirs. Yet, even in the sanctuary of trees, he learned that injustice had roots deeper than any earth. That prejudice could seep into every crack, every glimmer of hope, poisoning even the spaces that seemed untouched. Traders, soldiers, and even neighbors had conspired in subtle ways. A stolen coin, a delayed warning, a suspicious glance that carried centuries of disdain. Now, standing on the cusp of manhood, the man realized that the city itself had become a predator, each street a maw, each shadow a claw. He felt the eyes of history pressing upon him, a reminder that cruelty and oppression had shaped generations before him, and they would shape the generations to come. He was marked not by his actions, but by the perception of others, and the weight of that inherited prejudice threatened to bend him beneath its immense invisible pressure. And yet, in the quiet moments before the city's sinister machinery fully engaged, he allowed himself a flicker of defiance, a fragile ember in the darkness. He traced the worn edges of stone walls, noted the uneven cobbles underfoot, catalogued the faces of those who passed, a gallery of potential allies, potential traitors. Every detail mattered, for in a world that thrived on oppression, survival was born not from strength alone, but from understanding the currents of hatred and navigating them with subtlety. The market's chaos, the clatter of distant hooves, the faintest wail of despair from some unseen quarter, all became a symphony of foreboding, orchestrated to remind him that escape was an illusion, and the cruelty designed for him was already in motion, unstoppable as it crept closer with deliberate precision. Even the moon seemed complicit, shrouded in clouds, casting the city in a pallor that blurred the line between night and the inevitable nightmare he was marching toward. And then there were the men who had waited, patient and remorseless, their plans layered with the subtlety of venom. Each act of oppression a calculated strike against a life they deemed disposable. They moved unseen through hallways, through side streets, through the hidden veins of the city like ghosts, leaving behind the faintest evidence of their presence, a tossed coin, a smear of dirt, a glance from a shadowed window. These invisible hands had guided events, shaped circumstances, and ensured that every misstep the man made was noticed, remembered, and twisted into proof of his unworthiness. At the heart of their cruelty was not mere envy or greed, but a deeper systemic disdain, an inherited prejudice that had been sharpened over centuries into instruments of psychological torture. The man could sense their eyes in every reflection, their whispers in every gust of wind, their presence in the very stones beneath his feet. His heartbeat quickened with the rhythm of impending doom, each pulse a drumbeat in a macabre symphony designed to break his spirit before the final act. Yet even as terror constricted his chest, he could not entirely surrender. Some fragment of defiance remained, a flicker of consciousness aware that the world's cruelty was both arbitrary and deliberate, designed to shock, humiliate, and erase. The city itself seemed to conspire in his torment. Walls leaned in with menace, shadows lengthened with each passing hour, and the air grew thick with the anticipation of violence. Somewhere beyond sight, beyond reason, the machinery of fate had begun to whirl, and he knew with a bone-deep certainty that nothing could shield him from the horrifying spectacle that awaited, a punishment so grotesque it would forever etch itself into the memory of those who witnessed it. In that moment, the man understood the cruel symmetry of his existence, marked from birth, hunted by circumstance, and destined to confront a world whose hunger for spectacle and retribution knew no bounds. The city held its breath. The streets, the wind, the flickering lamps, all paused in anticipation of a horror that would outlast the lifetimes of those who had orchestrated it, a brutal testament to power, prejudice, and the terrifying consequences of a world that measured humanity not by heart or mind, but by the cruel, arbitrary standards of those who claimed dominion over it. The city that had once seemed merely oppressive now revealed its teeth, snapping in calculated cruelty at every step. The man moved cautiously, each corner and alleyway a potential trap, every passerby a possible observer of hidden malice. His world had shifted, subtle slights had evolved into orchestrated assaults, whispers into commands, and shadows into active agents of torment. His every movement was catalogued, every misstep amplified into evidence of unworthiness, as if the city itself conspired against him. In the market squares where laughter once echoed, he now felt the eyes of conspirators, watching, calculating, their intentions hidden behind masks of indifference. The merchants who once greeted him now offered nothing but fleeting glances, and even the children avoided his path, their innocence replaced by the inherited prejudices of adults. He sensed the rising tide of hatred before it struck, a careful accumulation of small cruelties, each one designed to wear him down, to fracture the fragile resilience he carried like a candle in the storm. He felt the weight of injustice pressing on his shoulders, and yet, for every act meant to humiliate, for every glance meant to wound, he found himself steeling against the world, his defiance growing silently, as though each injustice reinforced his will to endure. The streets themselves seemed to pulse with malevolence, and he understood that survival was no longer a matter of physical agility or cunning alone, but of mental fortitude, of anticipating cruelty before it struck, and of navigating a world meticulously designed to break him. As night fell, the city transformed into a theater of dread. Shadows deepened, alleys twisted unnaturally, and the faintest sounds, the clatter of a dropped coin, the scraping of a cart, the distant howl of a dog, became ominous portents of the horrors orchestrated just beyond his vision. Every pulse of the city reminded him that his enemies were patient, meticulous, and unrelenting, and that the true test of endurance was not merely to survive, but to endure the psychological torment that preceded the ultimate act of cruelty. The web of oppression tightened, not through a single blow, but through an intricate lattice of prejudice, betrayal, and manipulation. Invisible hands directed events. A sudden accusation here, a misplaced suspicion there, each incident meticulously planned to isolate him, erode his credibility, and strip him of allies. The systemic injustice that had been whispered about in the shadows now screamed in tangible ways, from officials who turned blind eyes to the orchestrated humiliation that left him exposed to scorn at every turn. He began to notice patterns, how a merchant's refusal to trade wasn't chance but deliberate, how a guard's scrutiny lingered longer than propriety dictated, how the walls themselves seemed to bend around him, subtly guiding him toward peril. Every corner he turned revealed new threats, strangers who lingered too long, messages that arrived too late, arrangements that collapsed with eerie precision. The city was alive with orchestration, each heartbeat synced to his rising anxiety. Each breath a reminder of the unseen machinery of oppression that had been set in motion long before he walked these streets. Shadows whispered secrets he could not decipher, and his nights were plagued with the memory of faces twisted in hatred, voices mocking him in silence, eyes that promised violence. And yet, amidst the crescendo of fear, the man discovered a grim clarity. He could no longer trust appearances, only intuition, only the subtle cues that marked danger. Every decision became a delicate dance between survival and miscalculation, each movement weighed against the invisible forces marshaled against him. The city had become a labyrinth not of stone and mortar, but of cruelty and prejudice, and he walked it knowing that the walls were closing in, that his very existence had become a trigger for hatred, refined into artful instruments of torment. His pulse quickened with each step, every glance a calculation, and the rising dread became almost unbearable as he sensed that the culmination of this orchestrated suffering was drawing near, that each act of injustice was a precursor to a horror so monumental it would eclipse all prior suffering, leaving only the stark, unflinching reality of his impending fate. The inevitability of confrontation pressed down on him with oppressive weight, and the city itself seemed to tighten its grip. Corridors twisting like the coils of a serpent, streets narrowing as if to funnel him toward his doom. Allies he might have relied upon had vanished, either through fear or manipulation, leaving him isolated, a solitary figure navigating a world designed for his unraveling. He could feel the psychological claws of his oppressors with each heartbeat, the invisible hands that guided events shaping reality into a constant threat. Every act of cruelty, whether deliberate or structural, was compounded by the man's growing awareness of systemic injustice, the subtle, pervasive prejudice that had orchestrated not only his suffering, but the indifference of the crowd that bore witness. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear gnawed at him, yet paradoxically fueled his resolve. The more the city conspired, the stronger his silent determination became. He observed the environment with acute awareness, the flicker of torchlight casting elongated shadows, the distant echoes of carts and footsteps masking hidden dangers, the air itself thick with anticipation and malice. Every encounter, every minor setback, intensified the emotional stakes, reminding him that survival was no longer enough. He needed to endure the orchestration of cruelty, to anticipate the culmination of his torment. And as the crescendo approached, the man understood the horrifying symmetry of his predicament. He had been born into a world where prejudice, hatred, and systemic injustice were not anomalies, but constants, where his every action, every breath, was measured against an unforgiving standard that demanded suffering. The rising tide of tension carried him forward, past the illusions of safety, toward the central spectacle of cruelty, that confronted him face to face. He felt the where the culmination of months of meticulous oppression, betrayal, and hatred would manifest in a scene so brutal, so horrifying, that it would etch itself permanently into the annals of history, a testament to the devastating consequences of prejudice refined into a weapon of psychological and physical torment. The square was silent, yet alive with a tension so thick it seemed to choke the very air. Torches flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the stone, elongating and twisting the forms of those who had gathered, spectators to a spectacle that was both horrifying and meticulously orchestrated. The man stood at the center, stripped of dignity, every sinew trembling as anticipation, fear, and anger battled within him. Above, clouds roiled like a dark omen, masking the pale gaze of the moon, leaving only the harsh torchlight to illuminate the horror about to unfold. The executioners moved with surgical precision, their hands steady, faces devoid of humanity, their intentions clear in the cold, unrelenting efficiency of their preparations. Each detail of the scene had been crafted to maximize psychological torment, the placement of the crowd, the distance of escape routes, the instruments of agony gleaming in the torchlight, and then, without warning, the instrument of death was brought forth. Molten gold, a river of fire and wealth twisted into cruelty, was carried in a vessel that reflected the flickering flames like liquid malice. The man's eyes widened, heart hammering as the realization struck with bone-deep certainty. This was the apex of the orchestrated suffering he had sensed for months, the culmination of all the prejudice, betrayal, and systemic injustice that had guided him here. The air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation, the collective breath of the crowd suspended, as if the city held its pulse, waiting for the inevitable act of unimaginable horror. The first drop fell, scorching the air with heat that seemed to sear reality itself. The man's mouth was forced open, his body racked with anticipation and terror, and the molten metal followed, a flowing, burning river of gold that filled every cavity, every throat, every scream that attempted to escape. Time fractured, seconds stretched into eternities, each one an excruciating testament to cruelty refined into art. The sound was unbearable, a wet, sizzling shriek of flesh against fire, the resonance of agony amplified by the stone walls that bore witness, without mercy. The crowd recoiled, yet none could look away, trapped by a mixture of fascination and horror. The man's skin blistered instantly, the intense heat enveloping him like a second skin, a cocoon of agony designed to obliterate both body and spirit. His body convulsed, every nerve screaming as the molten gold burned from within, a grotesque union of wealth and violence. Yet amidst the physical torment, the psychological horror was sharper still, the understanding that this was not merely punishment, but a spectacle meticulously crafted to instill fear, reinforce hierarchies, and demonstrate the power of prejudice weaponized against the innocent. Each convulsion, each gasp, each moment of unbearable pain was an embodiment of centuries of systemic cruelty, a horrifying crescendo of oppression that left both the victim and the witnesses in a suspended state of terror. The city seemed to hold its breath, the wind still, the torches flickering like the dying pulse of hope, as the man's suffering became a grotesque testament to the darkest depths of human cruelty. And then, as the molten river continued its relentless descent, the true horror of the spectacle revealed itself. It was not merely the destruction of flesh, but the obliteration of identity, of recognition of humanity. Every scream, every shudder, every convulsion carved itself into memory, a permanent scar etched into the minds of those who watched. The orchestrators of this atrocity observed with detached satisfaction, knowing that the act would echo far beyond the city, a warning to all who dared defy their arbitrary and brutal standards of worth. The man's final moments were a symphony of agony, a horrifying ballet in which every element, flames, heat, shadow, silence, combined to create an experience so overwhelming that it transcended comprehension. The crowd could neither intervene nor fully comprehend. They were caught in the gravitational pull of terror, empathy, and fascination, their collective psyche imprinted with the grotesque spectacle. And in the midst of this ultimate cruelty, a profound, unbearable truth emerged. The act was not an anomaly, but a culmination of systemic hatred, of prejudice meticulously nurtured into instruments of death, of power wielded without conscience. As the last vestiges of life convulsed and then stilled, the square remained silent, save for the faint hiss of cooling metal and the uneven breathing of witnesses forever marked by the horror they had seen. The man's suffering had reached its zenith, a terrifying monument to the lethal combination of cruelty, power, and injustice, a climax so extreme that it demanded reflection, a reminder of how deeply human malice can be refined into the most horrifying of arts. The square lay in silence, a void where screams had once filled the air. The torches flickered weakly, casting long quivering shadows over stones still hot with the remnants of molten gold. The city had witnessed a horror so absolute that the very streets seemed reluctant to retain memory of it, yet no one could forget. Whispers spread among the crowd, the faintest tremors of realization that what they had seen was not a singular act of cruelty, but the culmination of prejudice, greed, and the systemic malice that had guided every step leading to this moment. Those who had orchestrated the act departed with chilling calm, leaving behind a tableau of suffering and the indelible proof of human capacity for calculated evil. The man's existence, extinguished in a spectacle of grotesque brutality, became both a warning and a testament, an unflinching reminder that societal systems built on hatred and hierarchy could consume life with terrifying efficiency. And yet, amidst the aftermath, a faint pulse of reflection began to stir within the witnesses, a recognition that this horror was not natural, not random, but manufactured, meticulously planned to demonstrate the consequences of defiance in a world that measured worth through cruelty. As hours passed, the collective consciousness of the city wrestled with the weight of what had transpired. The whispers grew into murmurs, and the murmurs into discussions, subtle at first, then insistent, questioning, probing. How could society allow such acts to unfold unchecked? What forces had enabled the orchestration of such calculated torment? The man, once alive, now existed solely as an emblem of injustice, his life transformed into a narrative through which the world could examine itself. Observers began to see the patterns that had guided the events, the small slights, the manipulated circumstances, the structural prejudices, and realized that cruelty was rarely spontaneous. It was constructed, maintained, and perpetuated by the complicity of both the powerful and the passive. The horror of his death forced introspection, a reckoning with uncomfortable truths, that systems of oppression could refine themselves into instruments of terror, that silence and indifference could be as lethal as deliberate action, and that humanity's capacity for cruelty extended far beyond what imagination could tolerate. Yet, within this stark reflection, the seeds of awareness and perhaps change began to take root. The audience, both present and those who would later learn of the tragedy, were confronted with the undeniable lesson that prejudice left unchecked metastasizes into unimaginable violence. And as the city slowly exhaled, a haunting question lingered, reverberating through stone corridors and narrow alleys. If a single life could be extinguished with such precision and malice, how many more remained vulnerable under the weight of systemic cruelty? The man's suffering, now frozen in memory, became a mirror, reflecting society's darkest tendencies, its unacknowledged prejudices, and its dangerous appetite for spectacle at the expense of humanity. Histories would record his death not merely as an execution, but as a cautionary tale, a chronicle of what unfolds when power, hatred, and apathy converge. The torches dimmed, the streets emptied, yet the psychological and emotional imprint of what had occurred endured, a silent, powerful testimony that the consequences of injustice are never fleeting. The spectators carried away more than the memory of horror. They bore the weight of introspection, of guilt, and of awareness that society's moral failings could claim lives as violently and deliberately as any weapon. And in the quiet aftermath, a rhetorical question hung in the air, unspoken yet unmistakable. How long can humanity ignore the systems it has built to harm before the next victim falls and history's grim lesson is repeated once more? The man's death became a permanent testament, both horrifying and necessary, forcing reflection, demanding engagement, and leaving an indelible mark on every mind that dared witness the brutality of calculated injustice.